Welcome to this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, April 12th, 2023. And this week, we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. And as we do each week in the Roundup, we want to say a special shout out to those that are watching live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or LinkedIn across our SMIE Consulting social channels, but also recognize those that are watching on repeat and taking in the information and our thoughts on these 3 questions of the day. But also those who listen to the audio-only podcast version. I want to say a special thank you to all of you who are making the Roundup a part of your regular international edification. And as we do each week, we take our 3 questions from the news stories we cover in all the SMIE News Fit to Share newsletter that comes out each Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, either through email form that you can subscribe to at our smieconsulting.org/subscribe website. You can enter your details, see the archive of past editions, and then get the weekly email, 9 a.m. Eastern, in your inbox every week. That'll cover top stories on social media and international ed news, and oftentimes where those two overlap. And that forms the basis of where we pull the questions we cover each week from themes of stories we see developing in each week's news. Some themes that we cover are variations on a theme that we see happening on a regular basis with new insights and potentially new information that changes implications for what we do in international education. And obviously we want to make the time here on Wednesday a chance to go deeper into those themes and questions and news stories to see how we can leverage these tools and these themes and questions and answers, hopefully, into what we do in international education. And like we said, we have the newsletter version you can get by email, but you can also, if you prefer LinkedIn to get your international ed news and social media news, we have a LinkedIn version that combined has over 1,000 subscribers in the international ed industry that are getting the newsletter each week. So we appreciate, again, you making us a part of your journey each week in our field. So let's get right to the first question. It is, how did international education respond to the Department of Ed guidance? Now, if you remember, in February, mid-February, the Department of Education released this guidance that was initially intended to be for restrict U.S. institutions from using third-party providers who are outside the United States and or not owned by U.S. citizens from using any funds related to Title IV. Title IV basically surrounds federal financial aid, and this guidance would have prevented any funding that institutions get from federal financial aid to support these third-party providers, primarily OPMs that were the initial target of this for funding them through Title IV money. So that was the initial supposed intent of the Department of Ed guidance. And I use the quotes guidance because it's been anything but a guide to how to do things properly in government speak. It's been the antithesis of that, and the international ed industry has certainly responded vociferously in the last month and a half since this was released. March 31st was the deadline for public comment on the guidance that the Department of Ed set out. And there were early warning signs by the end of February, after organizations had a chance to read this guidance, that it sounded like it was a clearly poorly written and did not intend to have the consequences most international educators were seeing it could have if it were fully implemented. There was outrage initially from AIRC, the American International Recruitment Council, that saw the prohibition on working with or sending money from universities to pay agents overseas for students that they recruit for institutions. That was seen as a potential danger area if the guidance was fully implemented. You saw study abroad folks in international ed raising a fuss because that would impact most all relationships they might have with universities, where there would be funding sent to help pay bills for those students to attend study abroad programs, or even study abroad providers that are not U.S. based or owned by U.S. citizens. They would have been potentially in conflict with this new guidance. Could have extended to any third party that provides services to institutions in the recruitment or organization of study abroad programs or recruitment of students beyond agent relationships. So the impact on the international ed profession, if implemented, would be catastrophic. And rightly so. People have been saying, oh, it's just poorly worded. They really couldn't have intended to do that, because the Department of Ed has really kind of stepped up in the last couple of years, been a part of the joint statement on support of international education that State, Commerce, and Education signed off on a couple of years ago, and has since been renewed. They've been more active in international education issues, so it would seem counterintuitive that they would then put this guidance in place that would kind of sabotage, in effect, everything that U.S. institutions have been doing internationally for the last three decades. So, what is the response been from the international ed community? And it's fairly straightforward in terms of what the sector has all taken a unified stance on this. And there were 1,100 individuals and organizations responded as part of this call for public comment. There's a PI News article that provides a nice summary of all the various actors that have been a part of the conversation. ACE, as they usually do, NAFSA have all been a part of this as well, and drafting their own letters. And ACE warned that the redefinition of what universities could do with third parties abroad, if this guidance were fully implemented, that it could impact nonprofit organizations and foundations that assist low-income first-gen recruitment, retention and academic counseling, providers of clinical experiences for healthcare students, mental health providers, ed tech publishers, and high school agencies participating in dual or concurrent enrollment programs. So that's ACE's kind of niche there. Talked about what AIRC would have had problems with earlier, that RIT, as an example, said its 500 plus students projected to participate in study abroad annually would be impacted. That the University of California system Federal Governmental Relations Associate Vice President noted guidance would undo decades of work in creating study abroad opportunities that are accessible to all students in institution submissions. It could impact branch campuses of U.S. campuses abroad. It could impact that University of Melbourne in Australia said many of its students travel to the country with the support of U.S. financial aid. So that's, like I was saying earlier, U.S. financial aid implications. That was the whole main point of this Title IV prohibition on third-party providers. And it, again, seemed to be initially focused on OPMs, but the broader interpretation was taken to mean any third party that outside the United States that's not U.S. Owned by a U.S. citizen. So yeah, and as the PI article continues, it quotes the NAFSA response in that the DCL guidance letter flies in the face of the 2021 joint statement that we talked about earlier, that the Biden-Harris administration could be relied on to do everything it can to make your work easier in terms of international ed. So it would prevent need-based aid being used for students to study abroad. AIEA added that removing access to federal financial aid that Americans gain via Title IV funds will only further expand socioeconomic void in access to impact learning practices. So, I mean, it was really a cluster F, if you want to talk about it in simplest terms. What I really appreciate about the NAFSA letter is that it really assails the guidance as well out of bounds of what you would normally expect, and actually calls it illegitimate in a lot of ways. It was a legitimate goal without a legitimate process or policy. That's the tag from one of their sections of their letter response. That while that the department has a responsibility, yes, to protect the interests of institutions, taxpayers, and students, NAFSA says we are concerned the DCL fails to meet this goal because it imposes new requirements through sub-regulatory guidance without input from relevant stakeholders through an appropriate procedure, and because it exceeds current law and regulations. Furthermore, as written, the rules of the DCL frustrate a goal of Title IV programs to provide greater educational opportunities to a broader swath of American students. The broad language of the DCL has created great uncertainty within the U.S. higher education community as it works to build back from the devastating losses to the international education during the COVID crisis. And they urge withdrawal of the DCL or indefinitely suspend its effective date because it really didn't go through the right processes as well. That the department's attempts, another header, the department's attempts to substantively change the definition of third-party servicer exceeds the scope, TPS they call it, the scope of the Higher Education Act and department regulations. So it basically is trying to bootstrap new concepts into pre-existing definitions. And that means what a TPS is, or a third-party servicer, not the TPS reports from Office Space, totally different than TPS. But certainly as their new definition causes more harm than good, which I think was the whole point of the TPS reports in Office Space to begin with. So we'll see where this goes, but based on the responses we're hearing from educators, international educators all over the profession, as we said in our social post this week on this guidance, on the response, there's nothing like a good federal poorly worded guidance to rally, a poorly intended guidance to rally our community together. But I certainly think International Ed has realized its mistake and will be probably redefining what the ultimate goal is, and allowing institutions any lead time that might need to be put in place to affect the change that any new guidance that with its intended targets certainly does seek to regulate. So we'll see where that goes. But hopefully the revised guidance, which will come hopefully in the next few weeks, will portray a more realistic approach to addressing a problem in the industry. And there certainly are problems with overseas providers, particularly in the OPM sector, in terms of promises made on costs, on credits, and all of those things in online courses. So we'll see where that goes. But certainly, hopefully, an ignominious end to this Department of Ed guidance letter. So let's move on to our second question of the day. How can we avoid making mistakes like the Department of Ed in international education on campus? And this is covering a couple of different articles I saw this week. One, actually an excellent resource, I think, from our colleagues over at IDP Connect in the United States, where they put out a piece that was based on the top 10 mistakes international admissions offices make and how to avoid them. And the list, they cover different areas of admissions, marketing and recruitment, and strategy and operations, and how they look at how we do international ed. So that was one of the first pieces I looked at. A second was for specifically senior international officers, kind of the mega IE international ed kind of focus folks on campus, and where they're working as there was an article, actually the headline of Karen Fisher's Latitudes newsletter last week, came out on Wednesday, was for senior international officers, new priorities and new challenges. And it talked about how that these, it was actually an interview with Ahmad Ezzeddine, senior international officer at Wayne State in Detroit. And this was This was an interview she did after, actually probably after AIEA in the AIEA conference in DC earlier in February. And he talks about, Ahmad does, in terms of the kind of working in the gray, that the work that universities do and particularly in international ed, impacts the world, and has to be that way. Now, in terms of the challenges that he makes clear in his response to the article, where the crises that come into play, and that the decisions that you have to make on the fly, really based on gut, really, than any necessarily sometimes any data that needs to be or can be assessed or in a timely manner before a decision can be made. The impact, he talks about the impact of COVID and other challenges. There's emphasis again now on enrollment and finances and maintaining support for all of these activities, both study abroad and inbound students mobility, as well as internationalizing the curriculum and the campus, providing research opportunities for faculty and all of those exchanges that need to happen. So he makes the point is that there's a lot of turnover. There has been a lot of turnover in the field, and that's been an issue. Why are so many folks retiring, and the pressures of the pandemic and all of these other things. International being the first area to see cuts, oftentimes at institutions that aren't as fully committed, or maybe just dipping their toes in the water and decide, well, maybe we did push the boat out too far. Let's step back. He talks about really the challenges in the field, the reasons why that being in their positions to do good in the world, to help address some of the world's challenges. That the hope that we can make it a better world, as Ahmad says in his interview. So I think there's a lot from the interview that I certainly encourage you to read. Karen's interview with him in her last week's Latitudes edition. But there's certainly some mega issues that SIOs have to address, and how do they avoid those mistakes. And he makes the case very clearly in his interview that it's keeping senior leadership in the loop, and hopefully already as an SIO, already having the ear of senior leadership, presidents, provosts, that can keep them up to date as to what's happening in the field, what world events are going to impact international education, and what are the options for responding as an institution. Getting out in front of a lot of these issues early is always a challenge, and that's the role that an SIO has to play, to make sure that he's getting information from the ground up, seeing from admissions folks what those trends are in international, in terms of where there may be some pain points in systems that exist. He's hearing from study abroad folks to figure out if there's any challenges we're having in terms of implementing more robust study abroad programs. He'll hear from deans about some of the faculty challenges in internationalizing their curriculum and how they need support. So some really solid things that obviously Ahmad deals with every day in his role as an SIO that you need to be prepared for, and there are ways to avoid those, and it means both managing up but also managing down, and keeping yourself open as an SIO to the challenges that are affecting your staff and the students ultimately that are the beneficiaries of what you do. So great article with Karen, interview with Karen, that really touches on some larger points. But I do point to for the kind of nuts and bolts for the international admissions folks. There are some things that I've certainly written about before, certainly when I was doing some columns for IDP Connect over the years. Some of these issues that they bring up are ones that I've addressed. Certainly, they are the ones that I see all the time in consults I've done with institutions over the years. And some of the pain points that I know at UNLV we've certainly started to address. And one of those, the first mistake up on the board, taking too long to process admissions decisions. And I can't tell you how significant that can be to your overall success in enrolling students. Is if you have a deadline, or if you operate on rolling admissions and you make decisions as you get completed applications in your office, as we do at UNLV for undergraduates. If you are taking more than a month to make a decision when you're on rolling admissions, you are going to lose students as a result. If there are process problems, it could be that's mistake number one, taking too long to process decisions, to make decisions. Mistake number two is something that is also a real challenge and a barrier in a lot of places, having complicated, expensive, and time-consuming admissions procedures. Now, this is probably going to be the complicated piece is if you've got a lot of recommendation letters, a lot of essays, a lot of extra things that you require as part of the application. If you're still requiring SAT, ACT, and potentially subject tests, that's a complication. Because it also adds expense if they have to take additional tests. The expense of your application fee. We have a pretty substantial application fee that we can't waive right now because that fee funds positions in our admissions office, and that's something longer term is that we're working towards addressing. We don't have the ability to give out waivers, app fee waivers, to certain groups or certain areas without some really significant mountains to be moved. So that's a challenge for us. We talk about time-consuming admissions procedures. This probably for us is going to be more on the graduate side, where in the past, for this current recruitment cycle and for previous cycles, we required NACE's a credential evaluation from one of their approved credential evaluators companies like OS or an ECE, those type of services. That adds an extra layer of expense and delay in students being able to complete their applications in a timely fashion. Each year we might have 100, 200 files that never complete because of that credential evaluation that's required. Again, for us, that's primarily on the grad level, and for out-of-country transfer undergraduates, where we would require an evaluation of transcripts from college-level work. So that's a mistake. Mistake three, not offering enough scholarships and financial support. In certain markets, you need to have some sort of scholarship money, and sometimes serious scholarship money, up to half of tuition, to be competitive in getting students from certain markets. And a lot of colleges don't have that or aren't willing to commit those kind of resources. On the recruitment side, some of the mistakes, they say, using a one-size-fits-all marketing approach. And this is, you've got the same posts that go out over all your social media channels to students that you hope to target around the world, but certainly miss a swath of the world based on which platforms you're posting on, time of day that you're posting on, all of the different things that you could do wrong in marketing and where you're marketing your content. Failing to leverage current international students and alumni. And this is an obvious one. Any institution I work with in terms of comm flows we put together, marketing content that we want to have available, I say you got to get your current student testimonials and them involved in whether it's videos, whether it's written testimonials that you can have translated, inserted into comm flows, having them available for online chats, doing all that, having the successful alumni, having their stories captured and then repurposed again in comm flows and marketing approach. That needs to be a piece of the puzzle. And then also not being available where and when students are looking. So it goes to timing again. It's not, you could have the best content in the world, but if it's getting out there at times of days when they're asleep or not online, then you're missing the boat there. On the operations and strategy side, relying on gut feelings and past experiences instead of data to guide recruitment strategies. And that's so important that if you don't have data to back up while you're doing certain initiatives in certain countries, you're probably shooting in the dark. That you're taking on too much at once. And that's something that you learn over time, is that yes, I want to do this, I want to do this, I need to be there, I need to be here, but I need to go to this conference, I need to go to that conference. But you only have so many hours in the day, and you certainly don't have unlimited budgets. And when you try and do too much, you miss the end goal, and that's trying to build something gradually over time to meet targets that are realistic and practical and achievable. That you operate in a silo. That's where you don't have the direct lines to the people that matter in other areas that can help support what you do and who need to know what you're doing and be advocates for you up the chain. And then not having a yield strategy in terms of, well, we've got all these admitted students now, so what's the follow-up? What are we doing next to make sure we're converting them through the pipeline to get them in the door for the fall? So all those are the 10 that IDPs Connects has outlined and goes into some detail on their in their most recent guide. It's a downloadable sheet article that you can get. So it's 17, 18 pages, so it's well worth a read. And as a resource, I would certainly recommend having that on hand as you go through your day. Now let's get to that third question of the day, and it's a big one. What is the future of international student mobility? And no, we're not going to answer that in a Nostradamus sort of way today in terms of predicting that, yes, we're going to be have twice the number of international students in the U.S. in the next 7-8 years. I wish, and certainly if more institutions got their collective acts together and found ways to do international right, and including avoiding the mistakes that we just outlined in the previous question, and not having government guidance get in the way of things, and that's always going to be a potential obstacle. What I think this question on the future of international student mobility, again, is looking more globally about internationally mobile students. We've seen reports that as of 2022 at least, there were well over 5 million students studying outside their home country. We know that that's doubled in the last 10, 15 years. So the pie of internationally mobile students has grown significantly and will continue to grow. And the article that kind of drove a lot of what we're talking about here in terms of a bigger picture view of student mobility through 2050 is a report from Holon IQ that does a series of these reports fairly frequently, that they project an additional 1 billion post-secondary graduates worldwide through 2050. Now, that's not 1 billion post-secondary graduates who are looking to go outside their home country, but that's just a total number that would be looking to need or looking for higher education opportunities. And that's post-secondary graduates. So that's those that are actually going to be coming out of secondary schools, going into college and university, and graduating in the next 27 years. So there's clearly going to be a strong demand for higher education in the future through the next 27 years or so. That demand, because of capacity concerns in certain markets, that clearly they don't have the capacity to educate everybody who wants a spot within their own countries. A lot of them will start looking overseas. And that demand for overseas education will drive, obviously, students to explore overseas options. Will all of those come to the United States? Clearly no. If you've been listening to anything we've said over the last 3.5 years of doing these, actually 4.5 years of doing these lives, you know that that is not a process that happens in a vacuum. They don't all just come to the United States. That global international student mobility pie has grown substantially, as we said, more than doubled in the last 20 years. We see that pie, our percentage of the pie in the United States, we were a third of the pie back in the 90s. We're now 15% of the pie and shrinking. But our overall numbers have, over time, have grown substantially as well, more than doubled in the last 20 years. So what the Holon IQ report looks at, that looks at the demand for higher education, but it also looks at, I mentioned we're at about 6 million people, students studying outside their home country right now. But they're anticipating as many as 8 million students studying abroad by 2030. So from about pre-pandemic 2019 to we're at 5 or so to as many as 8 million by 2030. So significant increases in a fairly short order of time, less than in a little more than a decade. So Asia and Africa are going to be the key drivers of that growth. Asia is already 70% of the global student market. Africa is going to dig into their share overall. Those two continents will approximate 80% of the total global population outside of their home countries. Our total population of the world, 80% of the world's population will be from Africa and Asia between 2060 and 2070. So the numbers that are coming from there, obviously, that can't find places in their home countries for higher ed, is going to be quite significant as well. So the analysis does conclude that many students will be seeking an English taught degree or qualification because top institutions, half the top 500 universities worldwide are in the US, UK, Canada, or Australia. Global demand considerably exceeds the enrollment capacity of those top tier institutions. So there'll be more competition further down the chain beyond the big four destinations. That for the past 20 years, the big four have held on at about 37% of the globally minded students that are studying outside their home country. Their share is going to stay consistent probably, but other markets will come into play, and there will be more other destinations competing for those same students. So there'll be some notable shifts. The U.S. has lost about 15% of market share, as I shared earlier, especially in the 2015 to 2020 area. Canada gained the most, as we've seen with their 800,000 number currently in Canada, as we've reported on recently. So there's some real good data in this report. But the bottom line is total student spending from the report that was profiled in the ISEF Monitor this week. Total student spending is expected to be more than double to over $433 billion by the end of this decade, from pre-pandemic of just under $200 billion. That's globally. So quite significant financial resources that will be coming to those institutions that enroll international students through the end of this decade. So we'll see where it goes, but the future is certainly looking bright. It's going to be increasingly competitive, but there are more positive signs that students will continue to go seek out opportunities outside their home countries for higher ed. So hopefully we'll all still be in high demand jobs in the coming decade or so. So until next time, that's all we have for the Roundup this week, but we wish you the very best and look forward to chatting with you soon.